Public Utilities Commission in Grand Marais, Minnesota on, what is the date today? December 6th at 3 p.m. In attendance, Charles Hathaway, Commissioner. I'm Bill Hanson, Commissioner. Shane Steele, Neil Hanson, Mike Roth, and Patrick Knight. Meeting is hereby called to order. First item on the agenda is note that Commissioner Schulte is absent. First item on the agenda is to approve the consent agenda. Do I hear a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move to approve the consent agenda.
I'll second, and thereby it passes unanimously. And that brings us to our next item on the agenda, which is budget and rates continued. Mr. Roth?
Continued. At your last meeting, we finished the conversation about the electric budget and set rates for the electric fund for next year. What we have left is the water and sewer budgets.
Right.
So we'll just start with a little bit of information, a historical perspective on what our business looks like when it comes to selling water and sewer. If you would take this chart and go back in time another 20 years, it would look exactly the same. It is basically since the early 80s been a consistent downward trend in water sales. Our water and our sewer funds are based on water sales because we don't measure sewer separate from water. So this is how we derive all the estimates about how many gallons we're going to sell and what we need to charge for rates in order to collect enough money to pay for our operations. You can see a few bumps here and there. I think the most obvious one is 2020. Probably speaks for itself, but the regression line is clear here. We'll talk about what's going on in 2023 and then what we're assuming will happen in 2024 as we get into the rates. So let's start with the water fund. And we're going to need an increase. I'm suggesting 3%. Let's talk about why. Our personnel budget's actually a little bit lower in 2024. We can look into the details of why, but we have staff that do both water and sewer work, and between both water and sewer budgets, we budget for all of the time and labor that they will do, and sometimes it shifts back and forth a little bit based on just historically how many hours they spend in which department. Our supplies budget is similar to last year. You can see the actual amount we spend hasn't been as high as that, and it's possible it won't end up being that high in 2024, but I think we'll actually get closer to that in 2023. Services includes paying our own utilities, paying for ongoing expenses like phone and data, paying for contracted activities, like hiring somebody to dig a hole to fix a water main break for us. Things of the sort. You can see that that number is a little bit higher in 2024. That's where we'll pay for most of the small capital improvements to treatment plants or small capital improvements to replace one hydrant or fix one water main break or things like that as well, rather than larger capital items. There's a small miscellaneous that just doesn't fit any of these categories. Depreciation number you can see is higher. There's a couple year delay sometimes on seeing the effects of new projects. So for instance, our estimate in 2023, 165, was really based more on our assumptions about 2021 than what actually happened in 2022. In 2022, we added some new things to depreciate. Probably Highway 61 is the largest chunk of that. So that number has gone up in 2024, and it's going to go up again when we add Fifth Avenue into this. The depreciation we include in the expense side, it's not an actual check we're writing. It's just an amount that represents the loss in value of the capital items that we've got. So when we pay the check to buy the water mains in Fifth Avenue, we're not expensing that. We are depreciating it over time instead. So this is just a little different than people typically do with their personal checkbook, but this is typical for a small business. We're going to look at how we intend to use that money that we'll end up collecting to cover that amount on page 2 of this. The debt service is just the interest payments on our debt. And so here you can see right away, one of the first things we'll do with the depreciation amount in this budget is pay the capital side of the debt payments. And then there's a capital reserve amount, because sometimes when all these numbers add up, they're not quite enough to pay for all the capital things that we need to, and we'll talk about that on page 2 as well. Bottom line, we're looking at a water fund budget expense side in 2024 of $493,500. You can see that's $10,000 more than last year. So that's not a big increase on a $493,000 budget. That's just over 2%. The revenue side, most of our revenue is just utility bills. And in 2023, we imagined we were going to collect about $410,000 in utility bills. That estimate was based on the sales in 2023 versus the sales in 2022. The actual in 22 ended up at $390, so we thought we were going to sell a little more in 2023. And we're not actually going to sell a lot more. We also increased, though, we had the rate increase item in the 23 budget, so what we thought we were going to collect in 2023 was $410,000 plus $12,300, which is a 3% rate increase. We're going to collect just a little bit under that instead.
So you get 420 or something?
About 420 is what we've got in the base amount for 2024. So the assumption is that we'll actually end up a little bit lower, or a little bit, just barely lower in 2023 than we were in 2022. And we're going to assume that we're going to sell that same amount in 2024. If you look at that chart we started with, you might question why would we assume that? Because historically we've been going down and down and down at a noticeable rate. But we do have, I think, a lot of commercial activity occurring now that's a little bit different than the past few years, and so I expect to see that catch up. And I actually think in the next 5 years, I would see this number start to grow again, just based on the number of apartment buildings that we're talking about adding in the community, for instance.
That number, when you say that number, you're meaning the
Well, number of gallons that we're
Yeah.
going to sell in a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just for historical interest, to what do you attribute the decline in water use over the past 20 years?
We haven't done any studies on this, but my assumption is it's just efficiency. More efficient fixtures.
Yeah?
Yeah.
People are just...
And probably some less intrusion of rainwater in the system as you upgrade things too.
Well, the sewer side, we're definitely tightening
Oh,
things
this
up.
is water, yeah.
Just
sorry.
water.
Yeah,
Why would we sell less?
yeah.
Where you can see long stretches of this timeline where the population is not really changing, and so it's hard to explain based on that. It's possible that there are fewer people days here if you think about how long people actually live here versus how long they did 20 years ago. If this is a second home or they have another wintertime place. There's also been a lot of growth in visitation over the summer, and I think it's mostly due to efficient fixtures.
As they get replaced over the years.
Yeah.
Eventually that'll probably bottom out.
I would think
It'll
so.
only be so efficient, but.
We haven't found that to be the case
No,
yet, but
they keep improving.
and we don't really have the motivation here that some places do. If you were in the Southwest desert, you have to find ways to be efficient. We really don't, and yet the market's driven by places that do. And so I expect to see that squeeze down and norms be about saving water usage still.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like if you project this line out by about, I don't know, 2090 or something, we'll be able to sell the water plant and we won't need it anymore.
Yeah,
Just supply water for free.
probably not, but
Maybe not.
certainly save us a lot of money if we didn't have to operate it as a community, but I'm guessing we're gonna have to keep it.
No, yeah, it can't drop to zero. That's for sure. And, I don't know, I mean, if anything, you'd say population's gonna go up.
I think in the community, yes. I think there's been some population growth in the county, and some of that is going to start happening in the city where it really hasn't been for the past, say, 10 years,
Mhm.
because of the new focus on building housing here. And why is that happening? Because of these utilities. So they are ready to go to add more units. This amount of sales in gallons is really not touching what our plant is capable of producing.
Yep.
In the busiest summer months, of course, we get closer to that, but it's still not,
Right.
we're not there. So we can add this.
So you're saying that Grand Marais is more likely to attract population than, say, the outskirts or anywhere else in rural Cook County because we have the infrastructure, we have the.
I don't know if it's more likely. It certainly has been growing outside of the city limits just because there's available land. That's really the only reason, because there's not available land in the city and there is outside the city.
Yeah.
But now that we're looking at infill development and multifamily development, and that stuff requires utilities to work.
Yeah.
So that'll happen here.
Yeah.
We get a little bit of revenue from other sources. Some fees, you'll notice that number is down quite a bit because you lowered them this year. And so there's a couple of $1,000s, maybe even 7 or 8, that we would have put in there for facility fees that we're not going to collect anymore. That is, 1.5% to 2% of our budget, so it's not nothing. But it's not as big as the other things. We include a debt payment in the water fund that when we sold that bond, we actually didn't intend to use water revenues to pay back. We had committed other sources to pay back. And so there's a special assessment on properties and a debt levy. That one's not going to be around for much longer, but we still include it in the revenue side because we're going to look at using that money to pay some debt payments later on. There's a miscellaneous amount of revenue. That most of that now is interest on money that we have in the bank, which exists again, hasn't for a little while, but does again. If you look historically, that number goes way up and down. The miscellaneous, typically that is because we've either received large grant or we did some sort of capital project where there was a capital contribution made to the fund and its value is being collected in this line item. We don't budget for that to happen unless we really know about it, but we're not expecting to see that next year.
Wait, so 180,000 in 2022,
Yeah.
and that was interest? No, that couldn't have been.
No, that's, let's take a look. No, the interest in 2022 is inside of that 180,000, and I'd say it's probably closer to between 5 and 10. But we received a $92,000 state grant in 2022
I see.
that I believe was CARES Act type money. We have $15,000 in capital contribution, which was some project that was shared between funds that a portion of the value is attributed to this. And we received a transfer from the general fund of $68,000, and I don't remember what that's for. That
Mhm.
kind of accounting. So that's the 180.
Yeah.
And the interest was
Some part of it, but it was small.
2,700.
Yeah, yeah.
If we do a 3% rate increase, and if our sales in 2024 are similar to what they are in 2023, that will add an additional 12,600 in revenue. So that's the last line item for a grand total of 495. So that's a little bit, just a touch more than the 493. Both the water and the sewer funds have spent a lot of cash on large capital projects in the past 5 years, and so if we actually do end up collecting a little more than we need to, that's okay. But that's kind of a rounding error. It's not worth deviating, I don't think, from a simple percentage point increase to make that work better. So our history's been a 2% increase from 14 through 18, no change from 19 to 22, and then we did 3% again for this year's rates as well. The no change made a lot of sense for a while because the water fund actually had been accumulating some cash and had a cash balance. And those days are over because we spent $1 million on Fifth Avenue's water reconstruction, which was significantly more than we imagined it was going to be 3 years ago.
Mhm.
So that, on the one hand, means we can't really run flat budgets anymore because our expenses have gone up, and we've got to make those debt payments that are new. It also means that when we're planning ahead for the next major reconstruction project, we're adjusting what we think that's going to cost by a significant amount. And so when we're aiming for that next debt payment, we've got to aim a little bit higher.
And does the 3% increase somehow help with future projects?
It does.
In what way? Because,
Well, let's look at how we're going to spend our money.
Okay.
In the expense side, we've got a capital reserve, a debt service amount, and a depreciation amount. So those are all expenses that we're budgeting, which means we're collecting revenues to cover those expenses. We've got some cash that's pushed into our budget, but those line items, only the 16 is an actual check we're writing, and none of them line up with the real amounts. But what are the real amounts that we're using that for? The current debt commitments down here are these 5 items. The 2004 PFA loan, which we'll be done paying this year, or 2024. That's a 20-year financing, and so this will be our last year of paying that. And then the 2007 MMUA loan, also a 20-year financing, so it'll be a couple more years and we'll be done paying that. And the 2008 improvements is the same thing. So within 4 years, there's, 2/3 of this debt payment is disappearing. The exchange for that is the 2023 revenue, the Fifth Avenue bond. That amount is not the full amount of the payment. That's just the first year's payment, which often doesn't include, it's a ramping up effect. And so that's going to go up. We're really only collecting a little bit more in the expense side than we need to make these payments. So what we're saying is we think if we collect the $495,000 in revenues, we're actually only expecting our cash balance to go up by $17,000. We're also saying we've only got an additional $17,000 to make a new debt payment. Unless that debt payment starts in 2028. Then we've got an additional $150,000 to make it. So when we think about that next project, which in this case, the last thing that's left on our list that's significant cost is a reconstruction project. And we call it First Street reconstruction, but we don't really know yet what it is. I think through this winter, we're actually going to do some work with our engineers to scope out just how much we plan to include in that project. But I would aim for doing that work probably not earlier than 2027, because then the debt payment starts in 28 and we've removed some of these other ones and we've got a little room for it. So if we need another $120,000 in debt payment, for instance, to take on that project, if we just wait a few more years, we don't have to raise rates significantly to add it in. If we decide we have to move faster and we can't wait for some of these other debt payments to disappear first, then we'll probably need to raise rates a little faster.
Can you just talk, I missed, I think, a little bit how the depreciation expense works, because in effect, depreciation is just a reduction over time in the value of the asset, right? So
So we paid $1 million in 2023 for 5 blocks, 5.5 blocks
Water and
of
sewer
water
pipe.
main reconstruction. Those water mains were fully depreciated already. And so we
Had
weren't.
the former ones, yeah.
Yeah, the ones we were replacing. So now these new ones, we've added that $1 million in book value basically to our system.
Yep,
And rather than expense that million, we wrote checks for $1 million, but it's not going to show up in the budget that we wrote that check for $1 million because we borrowed it,
right.
and we'll pay ourselves back through depreciation. We'll pay the bank back with that payment. So we're leaving that as kind of a placeholder in an expense budget. It
So-
represents the loss in value of that $1 million over time. So we'll say, we'll assign that $1 million asset a lifespan of 40 years and just do a straight line depreciation over 40 years of that value. So we've added that chunk of, what is that, 25 grand a year to, or 20, something like that, to our depreciation amount.
And what I don't get quite is, where does that money go? So, I mean, it's in the budget, we're
Yeah.
collecting money, and then it's.
So it's in the expense side of the budget, which is kind of the tricky part.
Yeah.
Because it's not actually an expense in the sense that a household would consider it to be.
Right.
It's a recognition of loss in value. You don't necessarily have to collect enough rates to pay that loss in value.
Right.
Your fund balance, actual value will go down if you don't, but your cash balance, the amount you've got in the bank, won't change.
Right.
So we have it on the expense side. That's how accounting works, that you show that loss of value as a depreciation charge on the expense side of the books. But really, it's just a placeholder to make sure that we're collecting enough revenues to pay for the actual debt payments for these. And so we're doing that reconciling at the end here, where we look at, well, how much have we actually put in placeholders in the expense side, and it's 230,000. And how much do we actually have to write checks for? Well, it's 215,000. So we're good. We've got it covered. Our debt is going to be paid for by the rates we're going to collect. Plus, we're going to actually hopefully accumulate just a little bit for the fund balance.
So in a sense, this is, the depreciation line is, in a sense, it's really debt service.
It's not, if just from accounting, a debt service is a specific term that means the interest to service your debt. So this debt service is something that we track separately, just because that's a standard accounting practice, to look at how much you're paying in interest on your debt.
Mm-hmm.
And it's whether or not you're depreciating, whether or not you're calculating, you're collecting enough revenues to depreciate, you have to pay the debt service anyway, so we leave it in there. It's in some cases, we don't need to collect rates for the total amount of depreciation plus the total amount of debt service to make all of our debt payments. When that is the case, then we're collecting those revenues and actually building the fund balance with it rather than making payments. And then the next time we have a project, we can decide, rather than borrow money, we can spend some of that cash we've been accumulating.
Mm-hmm.
So either way, we're still taking that money that is on the depreciation side and collecting revenues to cover it, and whether we're using those revenues to pay for last year's project or saving up to pay for next year's project, it's still a way for us to make sure that our capital budget is funded.
Yeah.
Are there legal constraints on the debt service, or on the depreciation term, or do you is that just best practice, just best practices?
I mean, it's understood what it means. There are some generally accepted accounting principles, they're called, about how you calculate it. You can't assign a life to an asset that's longer than its actual life. There are some standard lives for typical assets. In this fund, almost all the things that we're depreciating are not things that other businesses own. Water mains, treatment plants,
Yeah.
that's pretty much it. And so when we decide what their life is, we've got some leeway there. And we're usually going to depreciate those items long before we need to look at them again. So even at 40 years, which is a really long life for any business to depreciate something, we actually expect a water main to last at least twice that long
Yeah.
in the ground before we're going to have to look at it again.
I hope.
Yeah. Which is good, because if you're depreciating, and that's how you're funding all your projects, is by depreciating your last projects, it won't be enough. Because the next project's gonna cost a heck of a lot more.
Right.
So we depreciate faster than their life, and it works out.
So, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, do you prefer a motion on each memo, on the water and then on sewer, rather than combining them?
I would, I'm happy to, talk about them both first if that works for you, but if you're comfortable with this.
So I just a couple questions before we go there. The 3% that you're proposing, that's really just you're finding the number that makes everything balance, really, right? I mean, it's not, there's
Yes.
nothing magic in the 3, is more, but you could say, well, why not 4, why not 2, why not 5, why not 1?
And so let's talk about some of that, because there's
Yeah.
some arbitrariness to both sides of this budget. The capital reserve number is in at $20,000, and yet when we do the reconciliation of the capital budget, we're actually 17 long of what we need to make debt payments. So we wouldn't have to put that 20 in the expense budget to cover our debt payments. As a matter of fact, if the 3% increase is 12, we could, lower that capital reserve by 12, not increase the budget at all next year, still have 5 more than we need for debt payments. So why 3 then? What are we trying to do here? And to me, it is a recognition that Fifth Avenue came in a lot higher than we had hoped it would be, and that we're not likely to go down from that. And so we're going to have to start creeping up.
Mhm.
And although there's not a case to be made that we absolutely have to have this 3 next year, in 5 years we're going to need it, and every other 3 that we do in the meantime. We're just trying to aim for that future point. We don't exactly know what it is yet, but we know that it's going to be expensive.
Yep.
If it was $1 million to do 5 blocks of water main this year, 5 years from now, it's going to be more than that, and we've got 15 blocks that we're looking at. So
Yep.
Makes sense.
if we're willing to do this now, it'll give us more flexibility in '27 to include more project.
So, another aspect of this, it seems to me, is given that the water use has declined over time, probably it's not going to keep going at that steep rate. Probably not. Hard to say, right? But in a way, it seems like it's a little bit of a. You could say in some sense it's a losing battle to keep increasing rates when the water use is declining. Same with electricity or anything else. You increase efficiency, people buy less, but now you're going to increase rates with less. Did you consider the option of perhaps just increasing the base rate, or the I forget what it's called, the
Yeah.
standard monthly charge?
We're going to increase both. So this 3%, we will just go across the board. So it's not just the variable per gallon rate, it's also the base rate. And most folks really don't, they want to know what's the total bill, right?
Right.
And they're not thinking about it in the sense of, well, if I just shave a few more gallons next year, I can lower my, people don't usually think about that when
Yeah.
they're using water.
Right.
So I think that's probably more appropriate when we talk about electric. At some point, like if we're concerned about the optics of what we are charging for a gallon of water, or 1,000 gallons of water in this case, then we could look at that fixed fee versus variable fee. And cities do this in very different ways. Like there are cities that just have a fixed fee only. They don't care how many gallons you use. There are cities that are heavily fixed fee, and there are cities that have a very small fixed fee, and it's mostly based on usage. That we're encouraged, maybe even required now, to care about how much people use. So we have a gallon fee, and it's most of our money still is in the variable side of this.
Yep. Well, and what I was thinking is, might it make sense to focus more or weight the 3% more heavily toward the fixed fee part of it? That way we'd be collecting more from the people who who are able to evade the, sort of evade, but evade the gallon, per gallon charge by not being here.
I mean, you're hedging the potential short of water sales by doing that. You're just trying to
Yeah.
insure against lower sales than you thought.
Right, and-
I mean, I think that's fine to talk about doing that. I don't know that I see this as a real strong need for us to worry about that. Because it's, we're talking about a rate increase,
Pretty small amount
it's
of money.
$12,000,
Yeah.
and it's a $500,000 budget. So
Mhm.
I'm trying to just make it as simple as possible
Yeah,
to understand.
no, I'm just thinking it's kind of on the theory of the thing, or to try to establish both fairness and then not disincentivize, I guess, anyway, not discourage the decline in use, because you want people to be efficient, that's good, it's a good thing,
We haven't done a rate study for water or sewer, I don't think, since I've been here. And so we've done that for electric,
Mhm.
where we really actually try to imagine what elements of our expenses are fixed
Mhm.
versus variable.
Mhm.
In the water side of things, it's a lot more fixed than it is in the electric side of things. So most of our electric budget is wholesale power purchase, right? So somebody else is dealing with that question of what's fixed and what's
Yeah.
variable. For us, it's the more we buy, the more it costs. And I suppose the staffing is fixed because we don't intend to up and down that number, but
Right.
technically that's kind of a variable cost too.
Yeah,
And when it comes to the water side of things, look at that $500,000 budget, and almost 200,000 of it is depreciation, which means it's really a very high percentage is our
Capital.
system in the ground.
yeah.
And I don't think that our fixed fee represents that very well. So if we wanted to look at that, we could. It's more of a rebalancing to try and get accurate about it.
Mhm.
I don't know that we need to get strategic because we have to worry about, what the number of sales is going to be. So if you look over time, it's declining, but not by much any given year. It's $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 at most that would affect.
Mhm.
So, and usually there's an explanation for why the numbers are doing what they're doing too. You can kind of tell a story about what's going on in the community when it deviates from what that straight line regression line would look like.
Mhm.
Well, as chair, I would entertain, unless there's more discussion, I'd entertain a motion to accept staff recommendation of a 3% across the board increase for the water fund in 2024.
So moved.
I'll second, which makes it a unanimous vote. It's passed. Move on to sewer.
So much more fun.
Is it?
It's definitely where the action is
Really?
these days.
Your mind's in the sewer?
Often. Yeah. So I guess, thanks, we've got other folks that are too, because this has been, the water is in some ways a lot simpler, and in some ways a lot more critical to the safety of the community. Like, it's an acute,
For sure.
critical safety issue to get clean water out there. Whereas the sewer is more of a chronic issue if there's a problem with it. But it's watched just as closely. And it costs a lot more for us to treat sewer than it does to treat water. So we have to spend a lot more time and energy and money on worrying about that stuff. Yeah, just the background, of course, is that we've got a permit with the state of Minnesota through the NPCA to have a sewer plant. Like, we have to have this
Mhm.
permit. And it's supposed to be a 5-year permit, and our permit expired in, was it 2014, Neil?
It was a while ago.
I think 2014, I think it's been 10 years expired, and the terms of the old permit carry over, so it's not like we are operating without one. It's just been that long to go through the renewal process because of the mercury issues, because of MPCA's own staffing issues, just because of a variety of things, but it's just like, wow, we've been talking about this, sometimes very actively, sometimes less, but for 10 years, just the permit side of things. And then we've been a lot more active in the past 2 years, and you've seen the results of the capital improvement studies we've been doing about the plant. And there might be $10 to $15 million worth of improvements that need to be made at the plant. And that is a lot to imagine how you can take that all on at once with a budget this size. So
Yeah.
all the action is here. It's much, we replaced the pipes in the street, and the sewer costs less than half what the water does. It's just, it doesn't go as deep, it doesn't have to be as robust,
Not
it's
as water
just cheaper
Yeah,
Yep.
to do. And yet, when we talk about the treatment plants, it's exactly the opposite.
flows downhill instead of uphill.
Yeah. So I'm recommending an increase of 2% in sewer rates. And this again, and we'll talk about this, we probably don't need one at all, except for the fact that we've got that $10 to $15 million improvement hanging over our heads, and we need to make sure we're always making progress to have the ability to pay for that, because we don't know how much of that we're going to have to pay for ourselves.
Because we may be able to access grants and
I mean, we have to at this
Yeah.
point.
public funding, yeah.
We can't do it without
Yeah.
assistance. It's just a question of how much are we going to end up having to pay for ourselves. This budget is not imagining that's $10 to $15 million. We're a long ways from being able to do that.
So what is it imagining?
I don't know,
I mean, but,
a
no.
couple million,
Yeah,
and not today.
yeah.
So, this one, the First Street project is in a similar place. We don't really know how much of it we want to do yet. I suspect that the water fund is going to drive the answer to that question more than the sewer fund. But the sewer fund has this other thing, the treatment plant, that is on the same track, probably needs work. It might take us 10 years to put that project together, but we've also contemplated it happening next year, right? Like any time in the next 10 years that the funding comes together, we're going to do a significant project in this area. So we did a 3% increase in 2017, 5% in 2018, 3 in 2019, 2 in 2020, and then we've done 3 for the past 3 years, and now I'm suggesting 2. We've got 3 relatively new people in this department, and that deflates the cost, but only on a temporary basis, of our personnel expenses a little bit, as they all kind of start towards the bottom of their pay ranges. Hopefully, in a couple of years, this number is going to go up quite a bit, because they're going to have experience, they're going to increase their licensures, they're going to get paid more by us.
Mhm.
That's what we want. But for 2024, this is what we need, just a little bit less than what we had in the budget for 2023. Supplies is up, and substantially if you look back in time, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Services is down, even more substantially. There is a direct comparison going on here. And my suspicion is, and the reason I'm suggesting 2% rather than more, is we're being conservative in this trade-off. It's actually going to be better. Miscellaneous, again, just lots of things occur that don't fit into these other categories. Depreciation, it's a little bit smaller of a number. Debt service is a little bit higher. And then we've got a capital reserve item that we're including here, and the main reason for that is to make room for the sewer plant improvements. So what do we include in the services? Sludge hauling is the biggest one that we pay for. In the $223,000, we have $100,000 set aside for dealing with sludge, which is the solid product or semi-solid product of the wastewater treatment plant that all needs further processing and ends up being trucked down to Duluth, where they run it through their sewer treatment plant. And that's expensive to take that amount. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of gallons
Yeah.
a year of that's being trucked down.
It's like a truck a day, isn't it? Or not?
It's sometimes more.
No.
We don't do it every day. And, you can do, it's not a truck a day, no, because the trucks have 5,000 to 10,000 gallon hauling capacity, so. But we'll do, when it's time to haul, we can do multiple loads a day for a couple weeks.
Yeah,
And,
this year we did about 2 loads a day for about 2.5 weeks.
yeah. But it's 100,000 down from 140.
And why is that? Dewatering or?
Partially, it's that, but what it really is Neil and his staff trying out adding, let's back up a sec. The basics of how this thing works, right, is we're using bacteria to break down the organics that are in the waste. And then those bacteria are what is happening in the sludge. And if we can get those bacteria to be more active, then they can break that down even further and end up with less volume to send out. So a combination of the decanting, where we're taking volume of water off of the sludge, letting it settle and sending the water back through, and then having more bacteria that we're actively putting into the system, we ended up having to do a lot less hauling this year. And we think it's repeatable. And we actually were talking to multiple companies that are looking at this technology where they actually come and build you a small bacteria-producing laboratory that's constantly feeding your system. And we decided really not to pursue that because we're getting these bacteria that are stabilized for transport and seems to be working. So we can buy bags or buckets of these and put them in to our system, and it's done well. We think it not only has it affected the ability to haul less sludge, but it's potentially also affected the odor issues in a noticeable way. So we're gonna keep trying to do that.
Yeah,
And
good work.
I think in just based on our results of what we think happened in 2023, a net saving of $40,000 isn't really enough. It's actually going to save more than that. And so we end up spending an extra $25,000 to $40,000 on supplies because the bacteria are not cheap, and hopefully save maybe $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 on hauling and processing. So we're not going to build that into our budget yet because we want to see it happen a few years in a row under different conditions before we know
Sure.
that this is completely repeatable, but we're going to start putting some of it in this budget in 2024.
From whom do we buy that bacteria?
A place called Team Lab.
Team?
Team Lab, yeah.
I was thinking that it would have showed up on those general expense sheets that we see every month, but I don't recall that particular name.
It does. It doesn't happen on like all the time basis. It's a couple times a year probably you have to buy
Yeah.
from them.
Probably 3 times a year. I've got enough put in right now to get us through the winter. 'Cause apparently this bacteria doesn't like -20 very well.
Yeah.
even
Most
in
bacteria
stabilized
doesn't.
form.
Yeah.
So we'd be happy to bring that to a future meeting and go into more detail about that sometime. But for now, just know that that's affecting this budget. Let's hope for the best here.
Yeah.
This could work out really nicely. We've got a similar situation in sewer where most of our revenue comes from utility bills, but there are actually a couple of bulk customers that provide significant amounts of revenue as well. So 2023, you can see we had a budget at 600 grand. There was a rate increase built in to 2022 that we probably outperformed a little bit this year. So even though we're slightly down in volume, we're going to end up with closer to $625,000 collected in the sewer bills this year. So that's where that number comes from next year, 625. The fees, again, are down a little bit. The gray water, leach, sludge, this is people bringing in bulk product that we're processing in our plant. And it's not really people, it's just G&G Septic that's doing all of it, I think. I think they're hauling all of it.
Yeah.
It's coming from different places, but the majority of it comes from their facility in the business park.
They're my next door neighbor.
Yeah.
Very good neighbor.
That it's good. Like for me, the ability for us to allow more of the county to access this major asset in the wastewater treatment plant, it's good for the county, which we want to be a part of. But it's also good for the plant because the plant's big enough to do it.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'd be hauling that to Duluth.
Well, that's right. So those folks in the county that are having their septic tanks pumped, hopefully that bill's a little bit lower than it would have to be because this plant exists. And it creates more business, local business is successful because of it. And it also adds a decent chunk of revenue to help operate the wastewater treatment plant. So it's really a good thing all around.
Mhm.
And that number's kind of gone up and down. We've got it 120,000, and I think that's probably where we're going to be. But that one's a little less predictable. There are other market forces at play, so it's hard to say.
Like what?
How often do people need to pump their tanks?
Oh,
Uh,
I thought you meant like competitors or something, or some other operations.
there sure could be. I mean, as you get further west in the county, I don't know who else is doing that business. So
Pete's the only one in the county.
So far.
so far,
Yeah.
yeah, probably got a pretty good leg up on that.
Mhm.
There's a little bit of miscellaneous here, and again, this is, at this point, is a lot of more interest than there used to be, but again, looking back in time, the number goes way up and way down, and you'll see that similar bump in 20 and 22, and it's, again, the same thing, some grants that came through for water and sewer. I guess maybe I forgot, one of those grants was from IRRB to help pay for Fifth Avenue and to help pay for Highway 61, so thanks IRRB for helping
Mhm.
out. So there's a total amount here in revenue of 772, which is about exactly the same as what we've got on the expense side. Again, however, we have this $30,000 capital reserve bumped in. Well, how do we need that? What is it for? The depreciation, debt service, and capital reserve adds up to $219,000, which is a heck of a lot more than we're currently paying in debt payments. So almost twice as much, almost 100,000 more for sure. So what we're saying is with this budget, we intend to build the fund balance by 100,000 this year and have $100,000 available to make debt payments in the future. The list of what the wastewater fund is paying debt on is quite a bit smaller than what the water fund is paying debt on, you'll probably notice. There's not the 2004 or 2005 or 2008 bond payments on this list. There's just 2017, the Public Works Facility, 2021, which now is refunding all the old debt payments, and 2023, which is Fifth Avenue. That 62,000 that's included in the 2021 actually will drop in 2004 and in 2024 and 2027 and 2028 because that refunding bond did actually include some of those payments. So this number is also going to creep down over the next couple of years, although that Fifth Avenue one's going to go up significantly in 2025. So probably balance out in the next couple of years on that, and we're still going to be 100,000 high. This is good. We're going to need this. If we were going to have to borrow $10 million, even if we could finance it over 30 years, that 100,000 is not going to get us there. We're going to be short a heck of a lot. So, I mean, can we finance an additional $1 million with that money? Maybe. So, we need to keep building this number up to make sure that we don't get stuck with a really, really big increase at some point when we have to fix that plant.
So, at the end of next year, what do you expect that fund balance will be?
We don't have a lot of fund balance in either water or wastewater right now. It's a few $100,000, maybe $500,000.
So, but is your idea that, or is the idea that continues to increase and we get it up to $1 million or $2 million or something? But you wouldn't use that money, still, if there's a treatment plant improvements, you're not going to say, oh, good, because you get $2 million here, we'll just pay for it out of pocket. You would still take out a loan, probably,
We'll do both, for sure. So
but it ends up being sort of like a down payment on the loan.
it's if we were to put together a really like detailed plan on what our target is for a fund balance and what we're going to borrow and what we think we're going to need to pay that back, there's too many variables we can't really know yet. And so that'd be arbitrary.
Yeah.
And so I'm just skipping a few steps and just leaving it
Which is-
arbitrary at this amount.
Which is fine, I'm just
But in
trying to-
general, this money will accumulate. If we decide that, boy, we've got enough right now, we don't need to accumulate more, then we can always flatten out the rates.
But
I
it's-
think, though, even if we accumulated $2 million or $3 million in cash, that wouldn't be a bad thing,
Hmm.
looking at a $10 million project.
Right.
And the more that we have up front to help pay for that, I think the better we'll be, in the sense that we'll lower the debt payment on that
Yeah.
bond, whatever we have to borrow. We'll be in a better position to ask for other people's help because we're putting some of our own skin in the game.
Right. But a big part of the increase, the proposed increase to the rates, is to allow that fund to be built up so as to be able to finance the improvements to the plant, which we are anticipating.
If we didn't do any rate increases, so again, this rate increase at 3% is just about 15, or I'm sorry, at 2%, it's just about $15,000. And that's,
Doesn't change things.
it doesn't change a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost more of a symbolic, it's a habit builder more than anything else, to make sure we understand that we have to keep aiming up a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, we're not picking that number we need to set aside because we will have things come up too in the next 5 to 10 years,
Mhm.
unanticipated things that we're gonna have to spend a decent chunk of money on. We may decide we wanna spend $300,000 to $400,000 on odor control stuff, for instance.
Right.
Because we'd already decided we wanted to do that. I'm not sure if we still do, honestly, but if we do, that is spoken for, every penny of that.
Yeah.
And so,
Did we have any odor incidents this summer? No.
Not that I know of.
Order complaints?
Yeah.
Would be the
I
incident.
really don't remember any.
I completely missed it summer before when it was so, people were so bitter about it.
Yeah.
Even though I commute through there every day and live close by, I didn't smell it at all, but anyway, that's good news. So if we're
We're
nearing,
in the right direction.
Yeah.
if we're nearing the end of discussion, do I hear a motion to accept staff recommendation of a 3% increase across the board
Two
for
on this one.
2%.
2%, sorry, 2% increase across the board for sewer rates for the budget year 2024.
And just, sorry, one more time, this would be, again, you're increasing the base rate plus increase, or at the same time increasing, but somehow getting 2% between the two of them.
We'll just increase everything by 2%.
2% for both.
The base rate and
And
the
the-
per gallon charge, yes.
That's what I meant by across the board.
Yep.
That's clear.
Yep, so moved.
And I second that motion, which makes it a unanimous vote. The motion has passed.
Great.
Thank
I have
you.
no further business for you.
Yeah, thank you for your work on this.
Yeah, who does all the accounting? This is a lot of stuff to put together.
It's a team effort.
Yeah.
Most of the accounting is done by Kim and Alyssa. Kim oversees all of our finances,
Yeah,
and Alyssa does a lot of the processing of bills, but Neil's involved heavily in figuring out what the expenses are going to look like and all the processing of bills, and makes a lot of the spending decisions.
Mhm.
And then I coordinate putting the big picture together at the end.
Yeah.
It's a big team effort.
Plan. Well, good work, everybody. Pass it along to those that aren't here from us.
yeah.
That
that's a lot.
said, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
We are adjourned.